the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
Welcome. Today's guest is Reg Ankrum. He's an author and historian. He holds degrees from Illinois College and the University of Kansas, Rock Chalk. Mm-hmm. My son actually went to the University of Kansas.
Yeah, Rock Chalk Jayhawk.
That's right. Yeah. He's the former executive director of the Historical Society of Quincy and Adams County. Reg has written numerous articles with an emphasis on antebellum America. He's the author of the prize-winning biography, Stephen Douglas, entitled Stephen A. Douglas, The Political Apprenticeship, 1833 to 1843. His research and writing on Stephen Douglas still continues today. Welcome, my friend.
Thank you, Rob. Good to be with you.
Thank you. Well, it's tradition here, Reg, to have a featured beer to accompany the discussion. Since Stephen Douglas is going to be our focus today, since he called himself, in his own words, a Western man, mm-hmm. and he made his way across Illinois, I've chosen Prairie Path Golden Ale.
Oh, that's a good idea. Yeah, except he'd have preferred Kentucky bourbon.
Yeah. So it's from Two Brothers Brewing Company in Warren, Illinois. It's 100% family-owned. The specific craft beer is slightly sweet, fruity, with a hint of lemon and a creamy finish. It's got a bitterness rating of 25. So for those out there listening, if they want to join us, it's completely gluten-free. Listeners can subscribe and leave suggestions for future beers in the comments. And if your beer is selected for one of the future episodes, you'll receive a $10 gift card from Hy-Vee. So please subscribe and leave a comment. So Stephen Douglas was an ambitious young man. Mm-hmm. He made his way east, or from the east to the west to Illinois. He became a prominent lawyer, judge, congressman, senator, which he's probably most known for, and a presidential candidate. Held many notable positions in government in Illinois and nationally. So that'll be our focus today, is Stephen Douglas. But to start with, it's not really the focus of your book, but can you give us a little overview of like where he came from in Vermont and New York and how he made his way across to Illinois?
Sure. Yeah, he was born in Brandon, Vermont, which in the home that his father and mother owned, which was next to the church in which he was baptized. And he was less than 3 months old when his father died of a heart attack. So he was actually a boy who was raised without a father. His mother, later on, when he was about 16 years old, remarried. She moved to New York and took Stephen with him. It was kind of a sad case early on in his life because he had an uncle, Edward Fisk. His mother, Sarah, her name had been Fisk before she married Stephen Douglas. And when Stephen Douglas died, she was alone with no one really to manage what her husband had always managed. And so she decided she was going to give her brother, Edward, the land that her husband had left her, 300 acres, and it was a nice farm. It did adjoin the Fisk farm. So for his agreement, Edward's agreement to take care of her and Douglas's sister, who was also named Sarah, they called her Sally, and Douglas, he got the farm, which really cheated Douglas out of his patrimony and his sister too. But in any case, he had the farm with the promise that when Douglas came of age, he would send him to Brandon Academy. It was a school, a well-known school. It was an academy. And at 15 years old, Douglas, who had been to subscription schools periodically throughout his younger days, and a subscription school was simply between fall harvest and the next spring's planting. Young boys and girls were sent to subscription schools. The teacher, who was usually a traveling person, or maybe one young man or woman, usually it was a young man, there would get $1 for the term. So in any case, the person got $1 per student, and whose parents subscribed the student to the school. So long story short, Douglas tells his uncle he's ready to go to Brandon Academy. His uncle said, son, my position has changed. He had just married and now had a 10-month-old baby, and he told Douglas he couldn't afford to send him, which bothered Douglas significantly. In all that Douglas wrote, he never mistreated his uncle, but it was clear he was very much disturbed by his uncle failing to keep his end of the bargain, because Douglas worked hard on that farm. Anyway, so he leaves home and he goes to Middlebury, Vermont, which is about 15 miles away, and becomes joins a cabinet making firm. And the man's name was Knowlton. Anyway, and he was a Whig, and Douglas was a tremendous Jacksonian. He loved Andrew Jackson. If he didn't have a father, he had a surrogate father in Andrew Jackson. And he would get in an argument with the guy who employed him. And ultimately, those arguments led to the fact that his employer asked him to start doing menial work around the house, and for Douglas that was just too much. He would not be enslaved, as he put it, and he went back home. And then his mother had remarried this fella, Gehazi Granger, from New York, Canandaigua, New York, and they moved to Canandaigua. It was interesting because his sister Sarah had earlier married Julius Granger, who was the son of Gehazi. So, and Douglas was a little alarmed by that relationship because there was a certain amount of shame related to what appeared to be an incestuous relationship. And so Douglas didn't very much talk about that. In fact, when he decided to go west and when he left, he wrote 17 or 18 letters from Illinois to his brother-in-law, Julius, did not write a single letter to his mother. He wrote a couple of letters to his father, to his new stepfather. But he was very much alarmed by how that relationship in the family might be taken. So anyway, that's how he decided to leave. He was fairly sickly as a boy, and his mother tried like crazy to talk him out of going west when Douglas let her know he was going west. At Canandaigua, he studied classics and law. In New York, they had a requirement. If you wanted to be a lawyer, you had to take 7 years of classical studies and legal studies. He had taken 2.5 when he found out that Ohio required only 1 year, and that's kind of the motivation for his interest in leaving Canandaigua. And he did leave, and he got to Cleveland, Ohio, where his cousin Daniel Rhodes was really a coming politician himself. Douglas was 20 years old at the time. His mother, who pleaded with him not to leave, finally accepts the fact he's going to leave, and she asks him, and this is a kind of more legendary than proven, but it's in several books, including mine. She said, "When are you coming back to see us?" And he said, "I will be back within 10 years on my way to Congress." He kept that promise. From Quincy, Illinois, he was elected in 1843. He left Canandaigua in June of 1833, arrived in Cleveland about 3 or 4 weeks later, fell ill for 4 months, and the doctors there said he was going to die and said, "You need to go home, son." And he refused to do that, recovered when the weather changed. He apparently had something akin to a malarial fever, and they thought he was going to die. When he recovered, he had this kind of epiphany that there must be something that someone means for me to do in life. He felt he had a second life, and he was going to make all of it he possibly could. So from there, he gets on a steamboat, starts traveling west, has no idea where he's going, has no destination in mind. And it's always amazing to me because he was 5'4". He was just a boy. I mean, at 20 years old, and there was nothing in the West. Sort of like John Wood, who came here to Quincy in 1819. When he left home in 1820, arrives here in Pike County. There was nothing here. And it's amazing that young men were willing to do that. Anyway, so he's on this boat, and he reads a book by John Stewart, who was a Scot who spent 3 years on the American continent. And he said of all the places he had seen, the most erudite place, the most beautiful place, and he compared it to the finest gardens and parks in Britain, was Jacksonville, Illinois. Well, Douglas was amazed because Jacksonville had been named for Andrew Jackson, the guy he had worshipped as a hero for almost 20 years. And so he decides, I'm going to go to Jacksonville to meet the people. I want to meet the people who named their town after Andrew Jackson.
Yeah, and the thing is, Douglas actually says, if I can quote him, he says, quote, "Everything which had political ambition behind it pointed to Jacksonville. Yeah. It was the pole star among American cities," close quote. And that was Douglas's point, and then you say in your book, quote, lessons for Douglas to learn in politics in Morgan County. So what lessons does he actually learn once he gets to Jacksonville?
Well, interestingly, if you think about it, Douglas arrived really a blank slate. He had been a debater at Canandaigua Academy. He knew Jackson. He knew Jackson's anti-banking policies, and he debated that at Canandaigua. And so basically what he brought was an interest in politics and certainly an ambition for law. Politics became more of an ambition once he got to Jacksonville than the law. But he was a blank slate. So when he gets there, and the point I try to make in my book is that what he learned, those lessons you talked about, he learned in Jacksonville. They were cultural lessons. They were social lessons. They were political lessons. They were philosophical lessons. You know, Jacksonville had the first college in Illinois. It had just been founded 4 years before he got there, Illinois College, by a group of Yale Divinity students who were themselves abolitionists. And the lesson that he learned over time from them was that they were anti-slavery, and they did consider themselves abolitionists. But in a sense, they were racist, and they were anti-black. The first president of Illinois College was Edward Beecher, the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, the son of the famous Lyman Beecher, the Boston minister. And he had to leave because he was usually out trying to raise money for Illinois College, and the board of directors ultimately let him go, but they installed Julian Sturtevant. Sturtevant was a very smart guy, and there were very smart men on the staff. Sturtevant, in his autobiography, wrote, in terms of abolition, that African Americans, and he called them Negroes should be free as God intended them, to let them do what God intended for them to do, which was to carry our water and wash our clothes. And, you know, that's not, and, you know, we would look back on that and say, that's not the treatment that anyone deserves. But that's what even the most enlightened people of that time believed. And Sturtevant was among the most enlightened people around. He was a good friend of Elijah Lovejoy, who was the martyr for abolition from Alton. And, you know, he was killed in 1837. And thanks, by the way, to Quincyans for promoting the idea of an anti-slavery society. Quincy had the very first anti-slavery society in the state, founded in August of 1835, and they promoted the idea to Lovejoy. In fact, they promoted the idea to Lovejoy that he moved to Quincy because they were concerned that he's going to be killed. You know, he already had a couple of presses thrown into the Mississippi River. His press, the Alton Observer, was an abolitionist press, and people didn't care much for that. So
and they proved prophetic.
Yeah. So anyway, Sturtevant and a guy named Jonathan Baldwin Turner, and there were others, philosophers, very famous philosophers at Illinois College. But this was the nature of the way blacks were treated in the most enlightened town probably in Illinois. And the reason Douglas goes there is because he's attracted from what this Scottish author had written. And in fact, even in this town where there was an anti-slavery society, the Morganian Society it was called, and other anti-slavery abolitionists. It was a major stop on the Underground Railroad, which actually started in Quincy, and they would send people to Mendon, where one of the 7 divinity students from Yale had started a church up there. His name was William Kirby. And so they would send people from, escaped slaves from Quincy to Mendon, and Mendon would shuffle them on to places like Jacksonville, and from there they would go on to Chicago and then on to Canada. But, for a very enlightened community, they still separated African Americans from the population. In Jacksonville, it was a little establishment, about 300 people, called Africa.
Yeah, I remember that from the book.
Yeah, they were so they were segregated even in a town like Jacksonville.
So what does he learn from that? Just in the fact that, like you said, that's an enlightened place, and they still segregate. Mm-hmm. And you say that he considered slavery an abstraction, but based on that, the political arguments that were even going on in the 1830s, that seems a little naive to me. that he could consider it an abstraction, or that you could constantly table this type of subject when he'd been at least encountering it all the way back to his earliest days in Jacksonville?
Yeah, well, the point was it was Jacksonville. Vermont, where he had been, had no slaves. Vermont was, when we became a nation of 13 states, all 13 states, when we became, when the Continental Congress declared independence, which is the day in which they did that, July 2nd in 1776, the Continental Congress declared independence. When they did that, all 13 colonies of Britain on that day, all 13, had slavery. Vermont was the first to give it up in 1777. So Douglas grew up and spent most of his childhood and most of his teenage years knowing nothing about African Americans, knowing nothing about slavery, may have heard here and there about it, but it was an abstraction. When someone talked about blacks or slaves, he'd never heard of it.
So he wasn't constantly encountering it in other places.
Right. He wasn't engaged in the situation whatsoever. And at that time, it was so close to the Constitutional Convention of 1787, it's a matter of 30, 40 years, that there was still the strong belief that slavery was going to be eliminated. George Washington was lamented so much that they weren't able to get rid of it in the Constitutional Convention. So the Constitution wrote slavery into the articles of the U.S. Constitution. But Washington always believed that, and this is what he said, because we provided an amendatory process, they could amend that constitutional law. Because we provided an amendatory process, we look for it to leave. It'll be gone. What he hadn't anticipated, what no one anticipated, was Whitney's invention of the cotton gin, which just
makes it more economically viable.
Yeah, where a man might in a week put up 50 pounds, or a day put up 50 pounds of cotton. It went to 2,000 with that gin. I mean, just it boomed. So the economics changed everything, and left Douglas and Lincoln with a tremendous struggle for the next several years of their lives.
So you mentioned his veneration of Andrew Jackson, and I just find it interesting how certain things may have shaped his politics in his life. So I think about the election of 1824, which you mentioned in your book, the corrupt bargain, and then Jackson, who gets the most of popular votes, and he gets the most electoral votes, but he doesn't get the majority of electoral votes to win. And that feels to those who supported Jackson to be stolen.
Great.
Does that shape his view of politics in general, that this is the way politics works, and it's rough and tumble, and you got to be prepared, and you got to be ready and do whatever you need to do because the opposition will do that to you? Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I'm not sure whether that actually reflected what Douglas would have thought. Douglas was rough and tumble in politics.
And that's why I think of it that way. Do certain things in his life he experiences, in this case, it's that election in 1824 where he just thinks it's stolen from his side and somebody who he holds in such high regard that shapes the way he functions in politics, that this is the nature of the way politics has to be. That's how you have to execute it if you're going to win, if you're going to proceed, and he's ambitious. So if I'm going to get to where I need to be, I'm going to have to function like that.
Yeah. Well, let me say, I think as a foundation, he never had a problem with the way the political systems were set up. Initially there weren't parties, and in fact, George Washington, in his farewell address, railed against parties. He started seeing factions growing, and he was very upset about that and said, this is going to be the ruination of us if we allow this to continue. On the other hand, it was Andrew Jackson who actually took advantage of the idea of factions because of what had happened when there weren't factions. And that was, when John Quincy Adams, for whom our town is named, became president in 1824 because Henry Clay threw all his electoral votes to him.
Correct.
Jackson then saw that there's a problem here. I was, much as today where Donald Trump loses the popular vote by 3 million votes but wins the Electoral College, that's exactly what happened with John Quincy Adams getting the votes of Henry Clay in the Electoral College. So it was at that point then that And John Quincy Adams was a so-called national Republican. That was what the anti-federalists ended up being called at that time. And the Federalists were called, when Jackson started, became the Democratic Republicans. He and his friends start this big push to start a second party because the first party cheated him, the corrupt bargain, so to speak. So the second party is elected in 1828. John Quincy Adams is a one-term president, and Jackson wins by hook and by crook, and it's probably one of the dirtiest campaigns on both sides of any around. And I talk a little bit about that in the book as well. But yeah, and I think Douglas, he was willing to accept what he found, and he was going to use it.
Just assume that's the nature of politics.
That was the nature of politics, and it really was. I mean, when he gets to Jacksonville, one of the most interesting things he does is he gains revenge for a politician who had been mistreated by another politician, who just happened to be the nephew of Henry Clay, by the way. John J. Hardin was his name. And if you drive to Jacksonville, you'll see Hardin Avenue there. And Hardin, Illinois is named for it, and Hardin County is named for his family in Illinois. So he was a huge guy. He was probably the most powerful Whig in Illinois in the 1830s. And Stephen Douglas, this 20-year-old pipsqueak, teaches him, he's not the most powerful politician because Douglas, literally ejects him from office. He manipulates the system to get Hardin, the most powerful politician, kicked out of office, and then he gets the state legislature to appoint him at 21 years old to Hardin's office. So he becomes the prosecuting attorney in the state's largest judicial district 4 months after he was told he didn't know enough law or procedure to practice. And he was certified and then became a lawyer and really a pretty good prosecuting attorney. There's a number of original sources that talk about they didn't expect much of him. But they found him one of the most able prosecutors in the state. And this was a guy named Justin Butterfield from Chicago. And Chicago was just a very small town at that time, but very small village. But
that's the interesting thing about this point in history and this location, like the West. Mm-hmm. Maybe you can briefly describe what the West meant, at least for Douglas.
Yeah.
But really, it created an environment where someone like Douglas or Lincoln can excel. A young guy, just through ambition, has an opportunity that may not be available in New York or Pennsylvania. I think maybe you can just describe what it means. In his words, he says, "I am a Western man," what that really means, and did it provide him an opportunity that maybe out east he wouldn't have had?
Well, I think that was it. I think he saw that, it was going to take him so long to become what he was an impatient guy as well as ambitious. So it was going to take him 7 years to get where he wanted to be. He came to Illinois. He decided to leave Ohio because he found out Illinois, if you wanted to become a lawyer in Illinois, you only had to be white, you had to be 21, you had to be a man, and you had to live here at least 6 months. If you met those 4 tests and you could get the testimony of 2 other lawyers, you were a lawyer. And that's what happened with Douglas. So he was, he recognized opportunity and he took advantage of it. And he made his opportunities by by building systems and structures that would allow him to take advantage of them. At 20, I'll give you an example. At 23 years old, he, a young man named Samuel S. Brooks, who was the editor of the paper in Jacksonville, it was called the Morgan Journal at the time, told him and admired Douglas greatly because Douglas becomes this teacher in a subscription school in Winchester. He was broke when he gets to Jacksonville.
Right, yeah.
And he's told by one of only 2 Democrat lawyers, and there were 11 Whig lawyers in Morgan County, that there's no way he'd find a job there. But if he went to Pekin, a new port developing on the Illinois River, he could practice as a justice of the peace, which didn't require a law license. He could learn law and so on and so forth. So he decides to go there, and he's on the bank of the Mississippi River at Meredosia for a week when he finds out the steamboat had blown up between Alton and there. So now he's there with no money, has no clue what he's going to do. And
I love those stories about it.
Yeah.
I mean, how could it? Things can change just by an event just like that. He stays in Winchester.
Yeah. And a man said from Exeter in Morgan County said, we've been looking for a teacher for our subscription school. So Douglas he leaves his case of clothing, his trunk of clothes at Meredosia, climbs on the back of the horse with this guy, rides to Exeter, and they look for 3 or 4 days and can't round up enough students. They can't find students. Well, Winchester hears about Douglas, this young man looking for work in a subscription school. They let him know that they do have students, and so they rounded up 40 students. He goes to Winchester, and he taught for 3 months and made $120 and paid his bills and went back to Jacksonville for $100 with $100.
And then you said eventually he becomes a state's attorney. And, the interesting thing about that is it's the combative nature of Douglas that I'm always really interested in.
Yeah.
It seems like that's just the essence of his politics. It's always acrimony and combat.
Well, I don't think so.
Political, it always seems like he's always in controversy with somebody.
Well, the controversy comes to him. What I've found about Douglas so far, and I just finished the second book a couple months ago. It's with the publisher now. It's supposed to come out later this year.
Cool.
And in that book, I think Douglas his greatest achievement in life occurs in that book, which is the Compromise of 1850. But what I found in Douglas, and there's a wonderful, wonderful resource, the Congressional Globe, which they started transcribing all of the debates. And so I read about 2,000 pages of this agate-typed Congressional Globe for this book. And what I found about Douglas was, number one, he was gregarious, extremely outgoing. He loved friends. He loved company. When he was in Washington, was at every social affair there was, and he sponsored a lot of them himself. And he never failed, with few exceptions. Those exceptions are extremely important. He never failed to yield the floor to another congressman who asked for the floor for a point of personal privilege or a point of order or something like that. Douglas was always very good about yielding. And to your point about, his being kind of combative, really, he was combative to the extent he needed to be. He held his chits. In my estimation, he was probably the greatest compromiser of any congressman I know, and that's where he made his incredible achievement in 1850.
Is it because you mentioned in your book that you don't view him as an ideologue at all?
No,
and he's very much a pragmatist. Is that part of the reason for that?
Yeah, exactly. If you're looking for advantages, you don't lock yourself into anything. Douglas, when he finds out from S.S. Brooks, forgive me for losing track on that, but when he finds out from S.S. Brooks that there had been 17 Democrats who announced themselves for candidacy for sheriff of Morgan County and 2 Whigs, well, guess who won? The Democrats split all the vote. The Whig won the sheriff's office. That's when Douglas decided, because he had some familiarity with it, knew about it, to bring to Illinois what he knew about in New York, which was the system Martin Van Buren started, which was a convention system. And that was, number one, anybody has a right to declare for any office he wants. He always found a way to put things together that always left people what they were entitled to. If you want to declare yourself for sheriff, you have every right to do so. But here's what we're going to do. We're going to do that in convention, where Democrats, instead of, announcing it to the world, I'm not real fond of, these primary debates now, simply because you have Democrats tearing themselves apart. And they had every opportunity to do that in a convention.
Right.
And then one person, after all this happens, one person is elected or nominated by his party, and the party then gets behind him. And the party can control how it works. And if there is a philosophy or a so-called platform during a presidential year, then the party is strengthened in convention. And, after that, there was an election for the state legislature. This was in 1836. And that election had... before that election, there had been 6 Whigs and 1 Democrat who were U.S. or state representatives from Morgan County. It had the second largest delegation in the state at the time. Following Douglas and Brooks' creation of the Democratic Party, to which Douglas gets himself elected chairman, so he's now controlling the controlling party, there were 6 Democrats elected and 1 Whig, and the Whig was John J. Hardin, the most powerful Whig in the state. And now politicians of like mind are now converging on Morgan County, asking Douglas, how the heck did you do that? And Douglas now sees another opportunity. It didn't strike him at the moment, but when all these people started showing up on his doorstep, which was at the courthouse in Jacksonville, he actually had an office on the first floor of the courthouse, and people start showing up from other parts of the state. How did you do that? He saw the opportunity to organize a statewide party, which he did, and which from that point on meant that it solidified his power from 1835 until the day he died in June of 1860.
So when
1861, excuse me.
When he's a state's attorney, what's life like out on the circuit for him? Because he's not very old, and he's going up against some very prominent attorneys, at least in Western and Central Illinois, that had to form him in some way to make an argument against some of the individuals who are the most prominent and most lucid legal minds that Illinois can offer.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing, number one, there really wasn't a code or there wasn't a set of laws. It was pretty much kind of common law at the time. And in a sense, you made the law up as you went along. And so Douglas, who had this fine way of molding his thought process to, what existed at the moment, won a lot of those cases.
And so kind of distilling it down so whoever his audience is understands.
Yes. He was asked once, and this is in the book, you probably read it. He was asked once, how do you generate such affection for yourself from these people? And he said, I eat their corn dodgers, and I envision that like a corn dog, but I'm not sure what a corn dodger is. But I eat their corn dodgers. I live with them. I sleep with them. I talk with them. And he adapted, basically the appearance of a Kentuckian. He comes in with not a fine suit, I'm sure, but he started wearing denim, and his favorite time was on Saturday mornings on the Jacksonville Square when all these Kentucky farmers start showing up. And Jacksonville's made up a lot of Southerners at the time, Kentucky, Virginia, Carolina, and so on. When all these old boys start showing up, they have horse races around the square, and Douglas loved the races, but what he loved more was after the races, people showed up in the bars, and there were several bars on the square and off the square in Jacksonville. And they drink whiskey together, and Douglas loved the taste of a cigar, so they would smoke. He was just one of the good old boys, and he had fought as a child in behalf of Jackson. But even in 1835, I forget which election it might have been, but he had a chance to run for Congress. He ran against John Todd Stewart, and they literally had a knockdown, drag-out brawl in the market in Springfield, and.
So like a fist fight?
A fist fight. And Stewart grabbed Douglas around the neck and took him twice with Douglas under Stewart's left elbow, took him twice around that market square. And Douglas finally latches on to Stewart's right thumb and bites it, and Stewart carried that scar for the rest of his life. So they were, it was knockdown, drag out. And Stewart got in a fight with Simeon Francis, who was the editor of the Springfield Journal. I mean, there was fist fighting, code duellos, there were duels and so on and so forth. Douglas was actually in a duel or scheduled for a duel with Jefferson Davis until both got talked out of it. So, they were...
So was that over the election of 1830, the congressional election?
The congressional election that Douglas lost. Believe it or not, there were 36,000 plus votes in that election. Douglas lost by 36 votes.
Now, he contested that.
He did.
And that becomes a point. Does he know Lincoln at this point?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Because he met in 34?
He had known about Lincoln from 34. He actually served in the legislature with him in 36 and 37. And Lincoln served 8 years. Douglas served 2 years. So 36 and 37, they were acquainted. But Lincoln had known Douglas. They knew one another from Douglas's first foray into the State House in Vandalia when he created the law that got the way state's attorneys were appointed changed. And Lincoln, kind of in a remark he regretted later, because he was always from that point on chasing Douglas. Lincoln for 30 years pursued Douglas and hated the idea that this little guy was so much more powerful than he was, until basically 1858 when he set his name nationally. So, but they knew one another it was actually 1834 when that law was changed, and it was because of Douglas.
So in that election, and then he disputes that election for months?
Spends a year.
A year.
Yeah.
And so there's someone who writes in the Sangamo Journal called a conservative, and he's very critical of Douglas. Who ends up being the person who writes those articles called a conservative?
Yeah, well, we know that was Abraham Lincoln, and there's some belief that was that Mary Todd had written one or two of the Rebecca letters that were also in the paper that were critical of Douglas. But the interesting thing about Douglas and Mary Todd is that they reputedly, and I did find that they were engaged, but I think it was more of a ploy by Mary to try to attract Lincoln. She was trying to make Lincoln jealous, and there's a wonderful story about
that's one way to do it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
If you want to make Lincoln jealous, cozy up to Douglas. That would probably do it.
Exactly. And their lives were so intertwined.
So women haven't changed.
Then. Yeah. They control things, But this is one that she lost, because what happened there was Lincoln had been on the circuit. He was riding the circuit as a lawyer, and when you got to town, there were people who needed lawyers, and they would hire him, and he would represent them in the court in Tazewell County or that sort of thing. And so he had gotten home in September. She knew when he was coming. She is now walking on the street on the arm of Stephen Douglas. Lincoln saw that and highly perturbed. 2 days later, he gets back on his horse. He had no reason to go, but he left and went back to the circuit, and he didn't get back until November, when at somehow, somewhere, and there have been a lot of historians trying to figure out how and when Lincoln and Mary Todd became engaged.
Right.
Because they got married. Well, they were supposed to get married January 1 of 1841. And Lincoln got back in November. So sometime between November and January 1, less than 2 months, they got engaged, and they're supposed to get married. And that's the famous, what Lincoln called the, I forgot what he called it. But anyway,
famous first or whatever. That time period where he's in despair, basically.
Despondent and apparently suicidal.
Because the way I understood that story was, and this is something that a lot of people don't know about Lincoln. They hear the stories about Lincoln and so forth, and a great leader and so forth, but he was plagued with these, what they call melancholy, or what we would call today depression.
Yeah.
And that is a classic example of if a psychiatrist or something would hear about an event that Lincoln did at that time period, where he's basically despondent for 2 weeks, and his friends are going out to him and saying, you have to recover, you're going to die if you don't do something about it.
Yeah.
So that to me is, it rounds him out as a person. It doesn't make him that statue in Washington. It makes him a person, and it's really who Lincoln was.
Yeah.
Not only was he ambitious and political and could be vibrant, but he also dealt with a great deal of depression.
Yeah. He called them the hypos. He called his depression the hypos. And anyway, on that January 1st, his fiancée, Mary Todd, was to be married to him in the home of Benjamin Edwards, which is still there in Springfield on 7th Street. It's the Art Center now in Springfield. And all the aristocrats of Springfield were gathered there on what was called Aristocracy Hill. And there were two young men who didn't show up. One was Stephen Douglas, because he didn't get an invitation. And the other was Abraham Lincoln, who he just couldn't bring himself to the idea he was going to get married, not sure he would, he'd be in love with her forever. So he didn't show up. And the next day, his friends, James Matheny, Stuart, Billy Herndon, there were other friends who went looking for him. They found him in an alley. They took away his knife. They took his belt away. They thought he was suicidal, and he was actually the leader of the Whigs in the legislature at the time. And you'll see in the record of the legislature, I think it was the 10th General Assembly, it might have been the 11th, but he didn't show up for 3 weeks. And
right.
A Whig leader certainly wouldn't do that. So yeah, he had problems, but.
So you don't think that the engagement or the relationship between Mary Todd and Stephen Douglas was ever very serious.
I don't. I think there was an engagement, but I believe that she was using Douglas. She never, her sister Elizabeth, who was married to Ninian Ward Edwards, he was one of the aristocracy in Springfield, asked Mary Todd one time, Douglas is a man who just keeps rising. Why would you have any interest in this like rangy, gangling Flitch Lincoln, And Mary Todd said, Douglas will never be president. And she said, he smokes, he drinks, he cusses, and he spits.
And Lincoln did none of those.
Lincoln did none of those. And she had this, at 8 years old, she tells Henry Clay that she believed he would be president. Clay tried, I think, 3 or 4 times and never did.
Comes close, but doesn't
come
win.
close. And Mary Todd had this fascination with being she insisted people call her when she became Lincoln's, President Lincoln's wife. She wanted to be called Mrs. President, and she was. And that was not unusual, by the way, for the time.
That was her ambition, I think.
Her ambition. She was ambitious, and she was smart and a brilliant woman. And
so in that time period in Springfield, you have a quote in your book from Joshua Speed, and it says, quote, "They seem to have been pitted against each other," in reference to Lincoln and Douglas, from 1836 till Lincoln reached the presidency, close quote. And that was Joshua Speed, and he knew both of them. So the competition wasn't just for Mary Todd. Like those two were rising in different political parties, and they both saw it. Is that accurate?
Yeah. In my book, I have a chapter I call the First Great Debates. Right. And it was like 1837 or 38, and Lincoln was on the side of the American system, which was Henry Clay's grand vision for public works, roads and highways and canals and railroads.
So it'd be like infrastructure today, like a huge, massive infrastructure bill.
Yeah, and so Andrew Jackson was on the other side of it. Douglas was sort of in the middle. He saw the value of public works, but hated the idea that, Lincoln and the Long Nine, when they foisted public works in the state of Illinois, had no idea how to pay for it. So, and Douglas was only 24 at the time, and it always impressed me that, even at that age, he was thinking about, how things work together. If you buy something, you got to pay for it. Where, when the state almost went bankrupt, when the Long Nine tried to get the capital in Springfield, and they said, we'll give you a terminal on the Illinois Central Railroad if you give me your vote for Springfield. That happened. Springfield got the capital, but Illinois got bankruptcy almost, where Douglas and Lincoln were battling on that. And Douglas did get a little personal there, because he told Lincoln, if you don't stop this log rolling, Douglas tried initially to introduce 5 bills where there were dozens and dozens and dozens of bills from all over the place on public works. Douglas tried to preempt that with a rational set of bills, which called for 2 railroads, river improvements, and his 5th bill said each project that was done had to have a cost-benefit analysis. Was it worth spending the money for? So anyway, Douglas and Lincoln got in a major battle about that. And Douglas ended up telling Lincoln, and I'm paraphrasing here, but if you don't stop all this, I'm going to make public the fact that you made promises to your constituents in the northwest corner of Sangamon County that you ignored once they elected you. And for a while, that put Lincoln over a barrel, because he couldn't that couldn't be let out, because the Long Nine might become the Long Six, and the Morgan 8 would then control the legislature. Be the largest delegation. So Douglas had Lincoln over a barrel, but Lincoln was not dumb. Lincoln knew what he knew about Douglas's connection and love for Andrew Jackson. And there was a doctrine, a Jacksonian doctrine, called the doctrine of instruction. Lincoln sends minions to Morgan County, and these guys get a small convention together and essentially tell these Morgan Countyans, your representative is not representing you. He's fighting internal improvements. So the convention drafts a doctrine of instruction that orders Douglas to vote for public works or vote for so Lincoln actually beat Douglas in that fight. And Douglas always hated the idea. I mean, under the doctrine of instruction, you have two choices. You do what your constituents say. And, of course, Douglas is a Democrat, and he believed he knew as well as anybody what he should do. But if he got an instruction, he never failed to use it. That happened in Congress, too, a couple times. So anyway, his other choice was to resign. And here he is, like 25 or 26 years old, 24, in the State House as a legislator, and he's not going to resign. And so he decides, I've got to vote for Public Works, which he did. And Orville Browning of Quincy used that against him big time during the time when Douglas is running from Quincy for Congress against Orville Browning. And Douglas kept telling him, he said, you keep accusing me of voting for internal improvements, which almost bankrupt the state. You know as well as I do, because you were there. And Browning was a senator at the time from Adams County, that I voted only the will of my constituents. That was not my vote. That was the will of the constituents. And the next place they went, Browning made the same attack.
You know what, and I don't know if I'm right about this, but I always felt like the Panic of 1837, if I got that right, could have been pinned on the Democrats and the fact that they got rid of the National Bank and the Specie Circular and so forth. So the Democrats were really dealing with that issue, which could have made politics difficult for the Democratic Party. But the Whigs, the Whigs at the time had to deal with the internal improvements and almost bankrupting the states. Is it fair to say that those two things almost balanced each other out so one party doesn't get an advantage over the other? Or am I reading into that incorrectly?
Well, it was pretty common on both sides for internal improvements. I mean, everybody wanted their piece of the pie.
Right.
And for those counties that didn't get an internal improvement, Lincoln and the Long Nine set up a pool of funds totaling $200,000, which would be worth several million these days, for those counties that didn't get anything. And so they got school or some special public work in a county. But it was Democrats and Whigs alike who were both pushing for internal improvements. So it wasn't as though one blamed the other, although basically it was the Democrats who solved the problem, because they literally were on the edge of bankruptcy. The state's credit had failed. They couldn't float. They were trying to sell bonds to pay for these projects. They couldn't sell bonds, and it was Governor Thomas Ford, who also happened to be from Quincy. He was the prosecutor in the 1830s from Quincy. And he called Douglas between Douglas's first and second session of the first Congress he was in, and which was so it would have been the summer of 1844, to come back and help him solve this problem, because people like Lyman Trumbull, who I think at the time was Secretary of State and a very good Lincoln friend,
right?
And they had a falling out when Lyman Trumbull beats Lincoln for the Senate in 1855.
And I know that's a completely different story, but I always love that about Lincoln, because what it did was it showed like he had such a long game. Mm-hmm. Where Mary Todd obviously is and very close friends with Trumbull's wife, best of friends when they were younger, and then she basically won't speak to her again.
Never talk to him again. Never talk to either one.
Right. And Lincoln can see that the politics didn't align for him at that point, but he wasn't going to burn a bridge. And that was one of his greatest attributes, I think, as a leader. He was able to, even when things didn't go his way, realize the reality of the situation. But so not to get too far off on that, but I mean, I always found that part of the story really interesting about Lincoln, and one of his greatest attributes. So he doesn't make enemies very, very often, even when someone like Trumbull kind of, in Mary Todd's perspective, would have been stole that election from him.
Yeah. Well, it was actually Douglas who was responsible for that, because Douglas's candidate, Shields, was right in there. Shields had been the senator, and he was in there. But Douglas had a feeling that, and there are reasons we could go into, but I won't here. But Douglas had a feeling Shields was going to lose, and his belief was that it could be Lincoln. And Lincoln, on the first couple of ballots, actually led in the election.
I remember that.
And so he kept going down. Trumbull keeps rising, and it was on the 8th or 9th ballot. I think it was the 10th ballot that actually elected Trumbull. But on the 8th or 9th ballot, Douglas had the governor, Joel Madison, who was married to a Quincy woman, had the governor ready to go. I'm sorry, he wasn't married to a Quincy woman. Their daughter married a Quincy man.
Okay.
But in any case, Douglas had Joel Madison waiting in the wings because Douglas's count was that Lincoln, Trumbull would not achieve, I think they needed 55 votes to win. They would not achieve, neither would achieve it because both had their men. Lincoln started out with like 50-some votes. He was very close at the beginning, and that kept deteriorating. Trumbull keeps going up. Lincoln gets down to 15, and they will not budge. And Trumbull can't get over the hump. Douglas is ready to bring Madison in, who was a popular governor, and although he was a crook, popular governor and ready to take the Senate. That was Douglas's plan. And it would have won, except, as you say, Lincoln was so magnanimous. He recognized, he knew what Douglas was planning. And on the 8th or 9th ballot, he told his 15 men, go to Trumbull, which they did, and Trumbull wins on the next ballot.
Right.
To keep the Douglas machine from capturing the whole ball of wax.
So that competition was still continuing at that time. So another part of your book, which I find really fascinating, is Douglas's move to pack the Illinois Supreme Court, which I think a lot of people don't know about. Could you describe that situation? Like, what happens when obviously there's a Whig-dominated court and Douglas has a plan to get more Democratic justices, and then he becomes one of those justices?
Yes. Well, keep in mind, Douglas didn't necessarily do stuff just because he could or because it was politically convenient or beneficial. What had happened several years earlier, the Whig-dominated court literally tried to keep Irish and Germans from voting.
Yeah, right.
Because they were always voting for the Democrats.
Right, and I know that was always an issue, not just in Illinois, but nationally, where you would have the Democratic Party. They were always pushing for immigrants to get the vote sooner, whether it's especially the Irish in the East Coast, get them the vote as quickly as possible. And the Whigs were always against that.
Suppress the vote. That was the whole thing. Get rid of the vote. Get rid of that vote. But so anyway, that was kind of the precursor, and there was one other case too for Douglas looking at the court and deciding this is a chance to do something right, and it's also a chance for me to make my next move. You know, he always, it was like if you look at his advancements, he was the greatest self-promoter since P.T. Barnum, who followed him. But anyway, so the court forever, from the beginning of statehood in 1818, the court was 4 justices. And most recently, they had been 3 Whigs and 1 Democrat. So the Democrat didn't have any, the Whigs controlled the court, which meant they controlled the law. And Douglas believed it was unfair. It was unrepresentative. And people had a right to have access to the law, and he believed that the Democrats did not. So he wrote a bill to pack the Illinois Supreme Court, and by that, what I mean is it would create 5 new seats. So it would become 9 districts, 9 judicial districts in Illinois, and interestingly, another bill, which at the same time he passed, recreated circuit judges. And, he'd got, at the time he wrote the bill to change the way prosecutors were nominated, he also got a bill passed that said Supreme Court justices would no longer ride the circuit because he complained that they were always politicking. And that gave the Whigs an unfair advantage over the Democrats because there were still all these Whigs and few Democrats. Now he does the reverse. He increases the court from 4 to 9 members, and now he gets another bill passed that reverses his previous bill, which says those justices will act as circuit judges, meaning that they'll have the opportunity to campaign or politic while they're out, which is exactly what he did. So in 1841, his bill gets passed. It's vetoed by the governor, and he gets it overridden. So now the court is looking for 5 new members, and all of them are appointed. All of them who are appointed are Democrats, including Stephen Douglas at the age of 27. So he's the youngest Democrat Supreme Court justice in Illinois history, and I believe there actually was one younger. I think Governor Reynolds was, but anyway, but one of the youngest at 27 years old. Now he's a Supreme Court justice, and he goes to Governor Thomas Carlin, who's from Quincy. It's amazing how much control of politics Quincy had in local politics. He goes to Carlin. Carlin was going to appoint somebody else, and Douglas had done the wire pulling in the background, and Carlin was forced to appoint Douglas to Quincy, which, Quincy was the headquarters of the 5th Judicial District.
So what's he like as because he's young, you mentioned he's the youngest, right?
Yes.
What's he like as an Illinois Supreme Court justice?
Well, as prosecutor, he got very good marks as justice. He, in fact, he was one of the few justices who did it, but there were a couple of cases he determined himself he had made the wrong decision in. And in those 2 cases, he wrote the order from the Supreme Court, which reversed himself twice. So, he was and one of those had to do with a guy named Warren, for whom Warren County is named in Illinois. Warren had a case, and Warren came in as the case was ending, saying, "I've got new evidence," which he believed would have worked his way. Douglas, as a circuit judge, had found against him. And Douglas, in thinking about it, by the time he got to Springfield to sit en banc, as they call it, when the justices got together, the course that case had been appealed. There was no appellate court; it went directly to the Supreme Court. That case was appealed, and Douglas wrote the decision, and he reversed himself, saying that he should have taken into account the additional evidence. There was an unfair treatment of the defendant when he didn't do that, so he reversed himself in that case. And he got good marks. I mean, people, there are judicial watchers who say Douglas's opinions were extremely well written. A lot of times they didn't write opinions. Douglas wrote his opinions. And I think in his 2.5 years in the court, he wrote a total of 23 opinions.
So that brought him to Quincy, actually.
Yeah.
And how long did he actually live here before, and not to get too far ahead, but his destination or his goal was always to be a member of Congress. Mm-hmm. And so he gets elected from Quincy.
Yeah.
Was the goal to get the justice position really just to position himself so he can run for Congress? Or?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yep.
And then he runs for Congress and wins, and then so what's that period of time that he's a justice and then when he gets elected to Congress?
Yeah. Well, he moved here on March 2nd of 1841. He's elected to Congress in August of 1843. So he was here roughly 2.5 years by the time he left. And he chose Quincy because as a judge, when he's here just a couple months, and Missouri tries to extradite Joseph Smith, the prophet for the Mormon Church. And Douglas finds a technicality that tells the governor of Illinois he should not observe that extradition order, which kept Joseph Smith in Illinois, didn't send him back to Missouri, where he faced a capital offense.
Right.
He was charged with treason against the state. He could have been hung. So Douglas then protected him in another case, a habeas corpus case in the federal courts, where he advised the attorney for Joseph Smith how to get around that case. So Joseph Smith loves Stephen Douglas, says he's a master spirit. We'll never forget what he's done for us. And Smith promised Douglas the vote of the new 5,700 Mormons who had moved here in 1838 and now were living in Nauvoo. What Douglas didn't anticipate, I mean, he knew the state was growing, obviously. What he didn't anticipate was when the state was redistricted because of all this growth, not only in Hancock County, but in other areas of Illinois, in northern Illinois. His district, the 5th Congressional District, was split right on the Hancock-Adams County line. So Douglas did not get the Mormon vote. He would have just overwhelmed Browning in that election, but he didn't get that vote. But he did ask Joseph and Hiram Smith to give their votes to Joseph Hoge, H-O-G-E, who became the congressman from the new 6th Congressional District.
So that kind of wraps up your first book on Stephen Douglas, The Political Apprenticeship. Is that where your new book takes off?
Yeah, it starts in 1844, and it starts with Douglas leaving Quincy on his way to Washington with his proudest possession ever, which is his certificate of election signed by the Secretary of State, Thomas Campbell, and goes from there.
So, and when does that new book come out? What's your?
It's this fall.
This fall?
Yeah,
Okay.
It's in production at McFarland Press, which they made the mistake of publishing my first book, and they wanted my second. And I've got one more to write on Douglas. The third will be from 1850, which is where the first ends, because the first actually deals. I'm very proud of it. I think it's probably the best piece of writing I've ever done, but deals with what Douglas found when he gets there. He knew he was going to find it, which was everything was about slavery. And here's a young man whose whole goal in life, he loved Jackson saying, the expansion of the nation is the expansion of liberty. That was Douglas all over. And since only Missouri and Arkansas were states at the time, he had all this huge West, which really nobody wanted to organize at the time. Douglas wanted to organize it. He said, I want this to become an ocean-bound republic from Atlantic to Pacific. And he does it. One 5'4" guy from Quincy organizes the western half of the nation. And they're the most remarkable things he does. One example, Texas, feuding like crazy over Texas, and John C. Calhoun, the great slave guy, now Secretary of State for John Tyler, puts his foot in his mouth and says, Texas is going to come in as a slave state because we won it for slavery. That screwed it. Texas was an independent republic, meaning it was a nation unto itself. It was tolerating to come into the United States because it had this tremendous debt which it couldn't pay. And Calhoun had just screwed the pooch, saying this is going to be a slave state. And the treaty that had to be passed by an extraordinary majority could not get out of the Senate. Time after time, it just wouldn't go. Douglas gets there within a few weeks. He suggests the resolution, writes it for a guy named Brown, a congressman, I forget where Brown was from. But anyway, Brown introduces it, passed. And it was so simple. Douglas didn't look to make things hard. His simplicity was simply, why don't we pass a joint resolution, bring it in under a joint resolution? There was no reason they couldn't. In the Constitution. And one thing about Douglas, he was a great lawyer and a magnificent constitutionalist. You'll read several points in the book where he just emphasizes that it's so brilliantly. And I carry no water for Douglas. I mean, the guy was as racist as the day is long. But on the other hand, building the nation is what he did. And the joint resolution, which passed both houses, required only a majority vote. Instead of an extraordinary vote that a treaty required to bring Texas in, Douglas writes the law to create writes the measure to create a joint resolution by which Texas now is in the Union.
So, if someone's interested in your first book, which was the main subject of our talk today,
yeah.
how can they get your first book?
Well, it's available at the Historical Society. And that's the best place to buy it because they have the best price I've seen. When my first book was published and I saw the price, I called the publisher and I said, I think you're prouder of this book than I am, because they had a fine price on it. And so anyway, at the Historical Society, I believe it's like $20 or $25. It was more than that. And Amazon, it's also available. It's available online at Amazon, Abe Books, Indigo, Indie Books, and so on and so forth. But I think the best price is at the Historical Society right here in town.
Okay, and that there's a gift shop at the History Museum at 4th and Main right on the square. If someone's interested in that or interested in our conversation and Reg's great book on Stephen Douglas, I'd definitely, if you like this conversation, that goes into far more detail than we could ever discuss today.
Yeah.
I want to thank our guest today, Reg Ankrum, and such a great discussion and insight on Stephen Douglas.
Pleasure.
If you would like to try our featured drink, Prairie Path Golden Ale from Two Brothers Brewing Company, it's available at Hy-Vee Wine and Spirits at 19th and Broadway in Quincy. Just tell them that you want the History of Go-Go featured beer. The intro and outro music is provided by the band Bones Fork, and their music is available on iTunes, Amazon, Spotify, and other places. So if you like that, go ahead and grab their music as well. And join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go Go.